A very good morning to all and welcome to NParks Spotlight. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and YouTube today. My name is Leslie and I'm from the National Biodiversity Centre at the National Parks Board. We are into the second week of the Festival of Biodiversity. This is NParks' yearly celebration of our natural heritage, organised in collaboration with the Biodiversity Roundtable. This year, we have activities all month long from 5th to 26th of September. We've got biodiversity talks, arts and crafts that you can download, and more. Something for the entire family, so do visit nparks.gov.sg/Festival of Biodiversity for more details. This month's special edition of NParks Spotlight features our partners from the biodiversity community. We are online every weekend from 10:30 to 11:30 in the morning, so be sure to join us on Zoom or YouTube. Today, we'll be learning about the highlights of our Garden Birdwatch program. Over the past 5 years, more than 1,000 dedicated volunteers have recorded their sightings of birds in our parks as part of this citizen science initiative. And over the coming weeks, we'll be joined by our friends from the Raffles Banded Langur Working Group, National University of Singapore, and Otter Working Group. Here is an overview of today's session. For those on Zoom, if you have any questions during the talk, you can send them to me, Leslie, as a private message, and we'll try to address a few of them later on. After our Q&A, we have something special for our Zoom audience. For the first time in the NParks Spotlight series, we are doing a giveaway, so do stick around for that. But for now, let's get ready for our talk. Our speaker has prepared a short interactive activity, so please take a moment to scan this QR code or type www.menti.com in an internet browser and keep this handy for later on. I'll give you a moment to do so. You reach a page that asks you for a code, but don't worry, we'll give it to you later on. Okay, we'll be moving on with our program. If you haven't gotten the web page open yet, not to worry, we will send the link again later. And now let's give a warm welcome to Bing Wen, Senior Manager of the Terrestrial branch at the National Biodiversity Centre, presenting 5 years of Garden Birdwatch. Over to you, Bing Wen.
Hey, morning everyone. Thanks Leslie for the introduction. My name is Bing Wen, and this morning we will be going through an extended summary of the latest book release titled 5 Years of Garden Birdwatch, which is a citizen science initiative that was designed to monitor the bird populations of parks and gardens across Singapore. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is the book we will be looking at today, a review of Garden Birdwatch from 2015 to 2019. And this book was announced during the launch of the Festival of Biodiversity last week. Now, to set the stage for the talk, rather than for me to spend an extended period sharing about the key facts and figures in this book, I thought we would make this a little bit more spicy and interesting by having a little quiz that you can participate in. So Leslie had previously asked you guys to go to menti.com to prepare for a code. You should be seeing the code on your screen now and in the Zoom chat below you if you are in the audience. So you can go ahead and key in the code and prepare for the quiz. Unfortunately, I cannot promise any prizes, but the winner can get bragging rights for having digested this book in the week since it's been released. And I can tell you that even if you have not heard of this book at all of the questions are multiple choice. So if you're really good at tikamming, as it were, there's still a 25% chance that you will get it correct. So I see we already have quite a few members in the audience. So thank you for this show of friendly competition. For those of you who have not joined, I will be starting the countdown. Before that, just to caveat a little bit, it's fastest fingers first. So speed and accuracy is everything. You might know the answer, but if you take too long to reply, then you probably are not going to appear on the leaderboard because there is a lot of people playing at the moment. So let's get started and you can get ready for question 1. So we'll start with something simple. How many sites are surveyed under the Garden Bird Watch? Hint is the same every year, and you have 4 answers, or possible answers rather, before you now. Okay, seems to have a pretty even spread there. For the 11 of you who guessed 64, that is correct. We survey 64 sites all across Singapore, ranging from your nature parks, some of the nature reserves, and even community parks as well. Okay, so just let the thing take the leaderboard. I see that KM and Joe have sort of taken an early lead, but it's quite close. So let's carry on and see how you guys fare. Okay, the next question is slightly more chim, and that is, how many bird species did our volunteers record during the last 5 years? Okay, in this case, it was the final answer that was correct. So the volunteers collectively recorded a very respectable total of 184 bird species during the 5-year period. This was about 44% of the 414 birds currently on Singapore's bird checklist. Okay, we'll continue to see the leaderboard. Seems to be quite dynamic so far. So we're moving on to question number 3. And what this question is going to ask you is, what is the most frequently recorded native bird species? So the keyword here being native, you won't find your Javan myna as one of the choices. So you can take your pick from these 4 garden birds on the list. Ooh, again, it's a very even spread. So for those of you who selected either the starling or the pigeon, you were right in some sense, which you will see later on, but the winner was the Asian glossy starling. So these common frugivores, they congregate in large flocks around fruiting trees in our parks, and they were clearly very conspicuous, seeing as the volunteers logged it as our most frequently recorded native bird. So I can see that the top 10 or so of you are fairly close. So we're going to close out the quiz now to see who takes it all. And the last question is probably simpler than the previous 3. And that is that I just want to know how many bird species are actually featured in this book. Ooh, I see that many people had a lot of faith in the writing ability of the authors to write about 75 birds, but the answer is actually the unpopular choice, which is the nice round number of 50. So what we did write about and feature in the book were all the 34 birds, which all the volunteers learned about as part of Garden Bird Watch. And we featured an extra 16 birds where the volunteers managed to collect enough data for these species that we could either show some trends or tell an interesting story. And some of these stories you will hear about later on in the presentation. So this will be the final leaderboard. Let's just see who takes it all and gets bragging rights for the next half an hour or so. So Harish with the soccer ball is a clear winner at the end. He easily beats the competition. So congratulations to Harish. Unfortunately, I don't have any physical prize to give you, but you can always participate in Leslie's giveaway later on and you might win yourself an actual copy of this book. Okay, so moving on from that, it's pretty clear that a lot of you either are somewhat familiar with the program or you may have just taken a wild guess at some of the answers. So it's okay if you just took a wild guess. We will be starting off with a quick overview of the Garden Birdwatch program to get everyone on the same page as to what we're doing and how this data was collected. So the Garden Birdwatch is part of the CIN or Community in Nature Biodiversity Watch initiative. These are biannual watches where trained volunteers go out into our parks and gardens to monitor specific animal groups. You can see that garden birds was the first animal group that was announced in 2015 as part of this series. And since then, the series has expanded to include other bird groups like herons, as well as you have insects like dragonflies and butterflies, and even the fauna that you find in intertidal areas as well. Now, as part of Garden Birdwatch, what actually happens is that the surveys are conducted over a week during the months of April to November. And this is meant to tie in with the peak breeding season for our resident birds in April and the peak migratory season for migratory birds in November, respectively. And before any volunteers are assigned to their survey sites, what they're provided is a training workshop where they are trained to identify 34 species of common, resident, and migratory birds. So this is important to ensure that every volunteer has some sort of baseline in terms of bird identification that they can contribute to the data in some way. And traditionally, this was done in person with a practical component, but we have since moved this teaching session online. So now any one of you can go to the e-module and learn about these 34 birds as part of the Garden Birdwatch. For those in Zoom, you should be able to see the link to this e-module in the Zoom chat, and you can feel free to share that with your family and friends if they want to learn more about the birds in our parks. Once the volunteers have familiarized themselves with these 34 birds, they are then assigned a site, usually a park close to their home, where they will be recording the birds found in the park through what is known as a point count technique. And you can see an illustration of this technique in the image on the right, where the observer is asked to stand at a particular point and record all the birds that he sees and hears within this radius for 10 minutes. On the left, you can see an example of how these point counts sites are spread across a particular park, in this case, the park at Yishun. And each of these sites are 200 meters from each other at least to make sure that the chance that the volunteer sees the same bird across all of the points is minimized. Now, we will next go into what has 5 years of getting over 1,000 volunteers to go to various parks all over Singapore, what they have seen during this period. So as you learn from the quiz, a total of 184 bird species were recorded. This comprises both resident and migratory species and constitutes about 44% of our total Singapore bird checklist. Of the most recorded bird species, unsurprisingly, the ubiquitous Javan myna is the runaway leader, as the bird is now supremely adapted to just about every habitat type in Singapore. So the observers see them just about everywhere. However, rounding off the top three, you actually have two native species, the Asian glossy starling and the pink-necked green pigeon. So as I mentioned during the quiz, for those of you who selected these two as the most numerous native birds, you are right, because as frugivores, these birds tend to congregate in large numbers around fruiting trees in our parks. So they tend to be the most numerous birds that many of the observers see when they do bird surveys in our parks. Rounding off the top 10, you have a good mix of native and urban birds. In the native birds department, you have things like the black-naped oriole, the colorful bright yellow bird that many of you would be familiar with. You have the sunbirds, in this case, the oliveback that feeds on the flowering shrubs by the roadside and in your parks. And you even have the collared kingfisher, which squeezes in to the top 10 list, a common and colorful bird of the heartlands. In terms of sites, you can see that the top sites for bird variety and the top sites for absolute numbers is quite different. For the sites with high species richness, they are either sites in your nature parks, your nature reserves, or some of the larger regional parks that we have in Singapore. This is expected because in many of these parks, they either have a wider range of habitats that are inhabited by a lot of birds, or they are just simply large green spaces which can support more birds in general compared to smaller parks. Nevertheless, the one interesting thing that you might have picked up from looking at the top 10 lists for richness is that all of these parks have a wetland of some kind in them. It could be a patch of mangroves, a freshwater marsh, a naturalized river, or even man-made ponds that have been vegetated and enhanced. And what this shows is that it demonstrates the importance of urban wetlands and how simply creating an urban wetland in your park can dramatically improve the number of birds that you can find in that park, because there are many wetland birds that would colonize these habitats. In terms of sites for absolute numbers, you can see that the figures change quite dramatically. The one constant is Kranji Marsh, which again is the runaway leader, and this essentially corroborates the sentiments in the birding community that this is one of the best bird watching sites in Singapore, because you are bird watching along an interface between a large expanse of wetland with its own unique bird life and a large area of woodland which has its own specialized birds as well. And when you go to these areas and watch the birds, understandably, you're going to see not just a wide range of birds, but high numbers as well. For the rest of the sites, a key feature of many of them, for example, places like Changi Village, Chinese Garden, or even Dairy Farm, is that all of these places have a lot of large fruiting trees of various species. And what this means is that when they are in fruit, they tend to attract a wide range of frugivores. And as you learned from the previous slide, many of these frugivores, like the starlings and pigeons, come in flocks. So they are quite noticeable, and the volunteers would understandably be looking at higher numbers of these birds when they count at these places. And this illustrates the effectiveness of planting bird attracting fruit trees if you want to have a wider range of fruit eating birds in your parks when the trees are in fruit. Now we will be zooming in to some of the 50 featured species that were mentioned about in the quiz before. In the interest of time, we obviously can't go through all the 50. For that, you would have to read the book in detail. But instead, what I have done is I have curated the list down to 8. And these 8 birds all have different life characteristics. And I hope that by telling their story to you, you will see how the data that many of you in the audience have collected has contributed to improving our understanding or even raise new questions about some of these birds that we take for granted. So we start with one of the largest and most charismatic birds on the list that all volunteers have to learn before they start the survey, which usually isn't necessary because most of you are familiar with the Oriental pied hornbill already. So this bird is one of our conservation success stories, and some of you might know the story of how it started out with a pair in Pulau Ubin in the late 90s, and through conservation efforts, they have since colonized the main island and are now widespread across Singapore. So you can see from the data that the hornbills are actually doing very well on our main island. You can see this because if you were to compare the April surveys from 2015 to 2019, in 2015, the volunteers who surveyed all the 64 sites across Singapore saw only 8 hornbills. This number had increased to 46 by the same survey period at the same sites in 2019. Interestingly, you can also see that the map below the graph shows a pictorial representation of essentially how the hornbills have colonized and are colonizing the main island of Singapore. So the highest density of hornbills is still where they were first found in Pulau Ubin, as well as the adjacent Changi village, which was their first point of entry to the main island. And what the hornbills have done since then is you can see that they have spread west. Now, the pied hornbills are not rainforest birds. They actually prefer a more open woodland. So you can see that our local hornbill population has executed a sort of pincer movement around the nature reserve. Rather than cut straight across the core of Singapore, you have a group that has gone north through places like Yishun and Woodlands, reaching Sungai Buloh. And then you have a group that has gone south, going through places like the Gardens by the Bay, Botanic Gardens, and now towards West Coast. And recently they have popped up in Jurong Lake Gardens. And you can imagine that if this survey were to continue for another 5 to 10 years, it is likely that these charismatic birds will colonize the habitats further west, and it will essentially cap off the colonization of the main island of a species that was formerly considered to be extinct from here, which would have been pretty amazing by all accounts. Next, we move to Singapore's smallest bird. You have the scarlet-backed flowerpecker. Now, these flowerpeckers are interesting because they provide important pollination and seed dispersal services for a wide variety of shrubs and trees in our urban landscape. The thing about them is that observers tend to have difficulty seeing them because they tend to live very high in the canopy and they are really small. So unless you know what you're looking for, they tend to be overlooked. Nevertheless, you can see that our volunteers did manage to record a fair few of them, and their population does show an upward trend across the survey period. This is a good thing because one of the initiatives that we have launched in our parks is to cater to pollinators by providing them with a greater variety of foraging plants as well as nesting habitat. So it's good to see that not just in the wilder nature parks and nature reserves, but even in the urban areas as well, you have pollinators like this that are doing well. Next, we move on to the bright yellow bird I talked about earlier, which is one of the most recognizable garden birds in Singapore, which is the black-naped oriole. Now, the story of this oriole is quite interesting. It was believed to have naturally colonized from Indonesia in the 1920s. And if you read early bird books about bird life in Singapore, many of the authors by the 1950s had already mentioned that this bird had become one of the most common garden birds in Singapore. You fast forward 70 years from books like this, and it's interesting to note that despite all the changes since then, the bird remains one of the most common, in fact, ranked 4 most commonly recorded birds in Singapore. And you can see from the map that the bird is found in high densities everywhere, not just in your nature reserves and nature parks, but even in your urban areas. And this is a classic example of one of your generalist bird species that has adapted supremely and cracked the code, as it were, on how to live in a rapidly changing landscape like Singapore. Now we move on to an equally familiar bird that is both colorful and conspicuous, but has a surprisingly mysterious element of its life history that I admit that personally I didn't even know about prior to analyzing the data for this book. And the origin of this, you might not expect, is your collared kingfisher. So this bird, again, would be familiar to most of you. I'm sure a lot of you would see it on your daily commute. Traditionally, it's associated with places like the mangroves and coastal areas. But in Singapore, it has found that the urban landscape is very much to its liking. And now it not only lives far away from water, it can do without eating fish as a large portion of its diet. In fact, you can see that the collared kingfishers in Singapore, they eat anything from crabs in the mangroves to lizards and other birds in urban areas. That's how well adapted they are. Now, the coolest thing about the collared kingfisher that you can see from the data here is what actually happens to them when they are not breeding. So in the breeding season, they clearly are very conspicuous. The volunteers have seen more than 300 of these birds in recent years. But what mystified me was how, when it came to the non-breeding season in November, it seemed like half of these birds had stepped into a portal and vanished from the landscape completely, only to come back in big numbers the following year. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I have no idea where these birds go, but what I do know is that it demonstrates how valuable citizen science data can be, because many of us researchers tend to focus on the rare birds or the cool birds, hoping to find out more about them. And we often take for granted these common urban birds that we see on our daily commute. So if there's anyone out there who wants to make some big discovery on bird behavior in Singapore, I can be the first to tell you that you do not need to go to the deepest, darkest forests to make this discovery. Some of the big discoveries might be laying in wait in the urban birds that you see right under your nose. So the next time you hear the call of a collared kingfisher cackling at you on your daily commute like this, yeah, you can just remember that he disappears in November for some reason or other, and no one actually knows where he goes or what he's doing during this period. Maybe you can be the one to find that out for the rest of us. So moving on from the colorful stuff, we go into the smaller stuff, which the bird watchers like to call little brown jobs in our own jargon. And that's meant to describe these birds that are generally quite drab in color, and they are really small and hyperactive, so it's very difficult to get onto them. An urban example of this is your common tailor bird. And I remember that this was one of the birds that we set out in the initial batch of 34 garden birds that the volunteers needed to be trained in. And a common feedback from the volunteers, the first volunteers for this program, was that, oh, I have no problem seeing the hornbills and the orioles, but even with you pointing out the tailor bird to me, I'm not able to see the bird at all, maybe just a shadow as it moves through the understory. And the good thing from the data is I'm actually heartened to see that our volunteers clearly have leveled up, because not only have they recorded a fair few of these birds during the 5 years, the numbers that they have been recording them at are also increasing. And again, this is a good sign, because one of the things as part of habitat enhancement that we have been focusing on in recent years is to improve our shrub planting and understory plants in our parks to create more complex habitats that complement the mature canopy of tall trees that we have. And that's because a lot of the birds in these urban landscapes are actually understory birds. They don't necessarily live in the canopy. So when you create habitat for these birds, it is good to know that they colonize these habitats quite quickly and become quite widespread. So for those of you who will be reading the book later on, you can see further examples of this. It's not just more adaptable birds like the common tailor bird that have adapted to these areas. You can find other understory birds like the Malaysian pied fantail or the ashy tailor bird that have benefited from such complex planting, as well as the creation of urban wetlands and the interface that they like to dwell in as well. So when you create these habitats, even though these birds don't look like they can fly very far, they would somehow find their way through the connectors to reach these habitats and become more conspicuous in your parks. Another long-term goal of the habitat enhancement efforts in the parks is we hope to encourage forest birds that are traditionally associated with our nature reserves to colonize and set up new populations in parks outside the nature reserve, because this would improve their resilience. As you know, our remnant forest is not very big. So if we are able to encourage these birds to set up new populations elsewhere, it bodes well for their future. And one of the birds that appears to have responded very well to this is the greater racket-tailed drongo. Now, this is traditionally a forest bird. In the past, you would have to go to our nature reserves or their adjacent nature parks to see them. But the good thing about this bird is that based on the data that the volunteers have recorded, it seems like the drongos have been spreading out and colonizing new areas away from these reserves. You can see that there is now a cluster of them in the south around our southern ridges, and you have further clusters in the north around Woodlands and Marsiling Park, and you even have a population in the west around Jurong Lake Gardens. And the coolest thing I think that you can see from this data is that what links your northern population to the central population and the south is the rail corridor, which is the longest green corridor that we have in Singapore. So aside from it being used as a recreational spot, what is most encouraging is that as the vegetation there has matured, we seem to start seeing more adaptable forest birds like the drongo follow these corridors to habitats that they previously had no access to and set up populations there. So hopefully, as we continue to monitor forest birds like this drongo over the next few years or decades, you would see that not only has it colonized other parks, but hopefully other birds from the forest would also be encouraged to use these corridors to find new homes as well. Next, we move on to a very different bird, a forest bird as well, but with a very different status from all of the birds that we have covered previously, and that is of an introduced resident. So many cities in the world have their own population of introduced birds, and these birds usually come in through human sources. They could have followed early settlers into the city. They could have been escapees from the pet trade. And one of the things about bird monitoring programs in these areas is that these programs are just as important for better understanding the introduced birds on top of the native birds as well. So today I have chosen to feature this very striking introduced bird, the white-crested laughing thrush. It's native to mainland Southeast Asia, so you would actually find it in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And what happened with this bird in Singapore is that it was first recorded around Bukit Batok Nature Park in the late 90s, presumably because it was very popular in the pet trade and still is in some areas. And I recall that my first encounter with this bird was also in the same nature park in 1999, where one evening I was just mystified by this laughter that was emanating from the bushes. And what happened as a result was that it took me 3 consecutive days of effort just to catch a glimpse of this bird. And I still remember then that all I saw was that it was a very unusual bird that was hopping on the ground. It had a white face and a chocolate brown body, and no field guide on Singapore's birds at that time could tell me what this bird is. So was eventually referred to a field guide of the birds of Thailand, where I managed to put a name to this bird. And this is a far cry 20 years on from today's situation, where if you have never seen this bird and want to have a close-up look at it, no binoculars are necessary. You just need to take maybe about 50 steps into Bukit Batok Nature Park, and you'll probably encounter a family group of these extremely tame birds just foraging by the side of the footpath. So with that context, what I found most interesting about this bird and the data collected by our volunteers is that you can see from the map that even though it's been more than 20 years since this bird was first reported in Singapore, for an introduced species, yes, it has established itself and is breeding, but surprisingly, it is still very localized in Singapore. So the area with the highest population is still Bukit Batok Nature Park, and it has since set up a satellite population in the southern ridges. And I wouldn't be surprised if, again, it used the rail corridor to get there. But what is interesting about that is that aside from these two areas, the bird is largely absent from the rest of Singapore. In fact, it probably isn't recorded for the most part anywhere in the east. And the reason for this is because, like all birds, whether introduced or native, they each have their own habitat preferences and behavior. And so obviously not every introduced bird is going to be as adaptable as your Javan myna and be in the hawker centers or your void deck. So when citizen scientist data like this comes in, it does provide you some benchmark for any further study you want to do on this bird. So in the case of the laughing thrush, looking at its distribution, you can see that it favors these well-wooded parks with some form of forest. And it may just be that it needs a particular microclimate associated with this park, or even a certain habitat type. Maybe it needs forests of a certain age with the leaf litter for it to forage in. All of these things are things that you can now focus on, because the data collected from your volunteers has told you that you can zoom in on these areas and find out why the laughing thrush is doing well in these areas, but in the 20 years since its introduction has not spread elsewhere. So it's not all about the native birds. It's not just about the introduced birds. The last bird we are going to feature is a migrant, in this case, the tiger stripe. Now, as part of the 34 birds that you find on your list, 4 of them are migrants. And the reason why there is only 4 is because migrants in general can be quite difficult for the volunteers to come to grips with. So for one, like the tiger stripe, many of them are quite small. They are probably around 15 to 20 cm, so slightly bigger than a short ruler. And they come in relatively drab colors, usually various shades of brown and gray. But more importantly, they don't generally call during migration. So what this means is that it removes a key way for anyone to look for a bird. So looking for migrant birds has a lot of luck and eye power involved, because those are the only 2 things that you can count on. So for migratory birds, I wouldn't read too much into the graphs, other than the fact that you can see why we need to have 2 survey periods. If we only surveyed the birds in April during the breeding season, you won't see a lot of these migrants, because most of them would have started heading back to their breeding grounds. So you have to survey them in November when they're coming down. And even when they're coming down, the numbers do fluctuate every year for a whole variety of reasons. So aside from local reasons like observer quality and so on, you have a lot of regional or even international reasons as well. So examples could be that the migrants have had a bad breeding year in their breeding grounds, or that because there is a bad weather along the way, they've had to take refuge in a forest patch elsewhere, and so delayed their journey by a few days or weeks. No matter how you plan your survey periods, it's usually very hard to hit the migration at the right time. Nevertheless, why this data is still important is shown in maps like the one you see below, and that is to raise awareness among our people and policymakers that the migrants are not just restricted to a specific spot. So many of you will be familiar with birds like that, like the ones you see at Sungai Buloh. Those are shorebirds, and they are just one type of migratory bird that frequent your coastal areas. But for migratory birds like the tiger shrike, they fly across a very wide area, and Singapore being so small, essentially the whole of Singapore is a flyway for these birds. So you're as likely to see a tiger shrike in your roof garden in Punggol as you are if you went to Jurong Lake Gardens at the same time of year. That's how the birds treat these sites. Because most of these birds are coming to the end of their journey. Most of them would be wintering in places like Indonesia. Some even go as far as Australia. Singapore represents one of the last places where they stop to refuel and make their final push. So all your parks and gardens, big or small, apart from supporting your resident birds, are actually being utilized by these migratory birds as well. And even if it's just being used for a few days, it is important to know the role these parks and gardens play, because by providing more of these areas, you not only support a greater number of these birds, you provide them with more habitat to refuel and carry on with their journey. So by having more of these green spaces, you not only are improving their long-term survival prospects because you make their migration just that little bit easier, but as the habitat improves, they might even start wintering in these areas as well. Now, all the 8 birds that you have seen in the past 8 slides, their stories were brought to light thanks to data collected by our volunteers. If this has inspired you to pick up that binoculars that has been sitting around in your cupboard, then we've got you covered. So these are my 5 tips to beginners who want to start out bird watching. And if you are afraid that you would forget these tips, for those of you in Zoom, you should have a YouTube link that contains a tutorial with the exact same tips that you can share or save onto your devices. So the 5 tips that I would share are that the early or very late bird, in this case, gets the worm. And this saying was derived from the habits of most birds, where, as you would imagine, they are most active early in the morning, just after they wake up, generally between the times of 7:30 to 9:30 in the morning. Now, I know a lot of beginners are not fans of waking up before sunrise to do bird watching. So the consolation for that is that I can tell you there is another period just before dusk, between 5 to 7 p.m., where there is also a burst of activity before the birds go to sleep for the day. But rest assured that this evening burst is never as intense as the morning. So for best experience, you should make it a point to wake up early to literally watch the early birds catch their worms, because you will just see more birds during this period as opposed to in the evening. Next, when you do go bird watching, just be mindful that doing it with your naked eye is not the best way to do it, because even in the best viewing conditions, you may be able to see the outline of the bird, or maybe even just see its color, but you won't be able to appreciate the finer details of its plumage. For that, you would need to get yourself a binoculars, or at the very least, a compact camera with a zoom function, so that you can see things like the yellow vent on a yellow vented boo-boo, for example. Next, it is important to pick the right spot. You want to be birding where there is greenery, because where there's greenery, there usually are some birds. And the good thing about Singapore is that you don't have to go very far. In many cases, you could even look out of your window towards a green patch or a grove of roadside trees. However, again, I would recommend that you go to a neighborhood park for a better experience, because again, the bigger the green space, the greater the variety of birds that you will see, as well as the number of birds that you would see. And when you do go on these trips, especially for beginners, it's often helpful to have a friend or two along. And the reason for that is the more eyes you have, the more likely you are to pick out movement and birds that you might have missed when you're doing it alone. Of course, you don't want to go with too many people, not just because of current safe distancing measures, but also because when there are big groups, you tend to be distracted by conversation and you end up missing more birds than you actually see. But having a friend or two along tends to make the experience much better. Last but not least, you should always try to identify what you see. And I would like to refer to an old Chinese saying, which goes something along the lines of the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. And that is really very true in bird watching. It is a lot more impactful to tell your friends that you saw an oriental pied hornbill during your evening walk in the park than telling them that you saw a big black and white bird flying through the park on your evening walk. It makes a world of difference and might be much more fulfilling both to you as well as to the friends that you hope to interest them in joining you on these bird walks. So as much as possible, you should always have some sort of bird guide or an app on your phone that is able to identify the birds that you see. And what better way to start with this than to obtain either the e-version or the physical copy of the book that we have been talking about so far. So one lucky viewer is going to get a hard copy later on from Leslie. For the rest of you, don't worry, there's no FOMO here. You can get the ebook available for free at the link shown on the slide, and there should be a link in the Zoom chat as well. If you prefer to have a physical copy but don't want to go out, you can go to the Garden Shop online portal to purchase a copy. But my personal preference would be for you to go down to the garden shop in the Botanic Gardens to buy a hard copy. Not just because there is an early bird discount until the end of the month, but also because if you remember, the Botanic Gardens is ranked 8 in terms of the variety of birds observed by our citizen scientists over the last 10 years. So why not start your bird watching journey with a book in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other in the park right behind the shop. And you have a free ID guide that features 50 of the common bird species you're likely to encounter there at your fingertips. And with that, I've come to the end. I will pass the time back to Leslie, and I wish you guys the best of luck in winning the hard copy of this book later on. Back to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Bing Wen. Now on to our Q&A. Thank you to everybody who submitted their questions. Okay. First question for you is, how would the volunteers' level of birdwatching experience affect the results?
So personally, what I have noticed is that every volunteers, regardless of their experience level, can play a part. The absolute beginners tend to notice the big and colorful birds, so they tend to notice the hornbills, the orioles, and the kingfishers first of all. And as they gain experience and if they continue down this road, they start noticing the smaller things, so things like the ioras, the sunbirds, and the flycatchers. And you can see that over the 5 years, we've had volunteers who have started out in their neighborhood parks, and once they have gained familiarity with that, they have moved on to more complex habitats. So for the beginners, you would be in your parks where you would get used to the simpler bird communities found there. And then when your level of experience has increased, you would have the option to go to more complex areas like our nature parks to further your journey, your bird watching journey from there.
Okay, so there is a learning curve. Sometimes you say start small, but in the case of our volunteers, they start by learning to identify some of the bigger and more conspicuous birds. But not to worry, this is still valuable data. And over time, as they birdwatch more, they can go to areas with higher diversity to do their surveys. Next question. Are there opportunities for volunteers to level up and learn more birds beyond the 34 species?
Yes, there are. So for volunteers who are now very familiar with their 34 species, we have recently launched another series of training workshops that are aimed at teaching volunteers about birds associated with the forest. So as part of these workshops, you will learn about 20 additional birds that you find in our forest. So you start learning about birds like the greater racket-tailed drongo, straw-headed boo-boo, various babblers and boo-boos, and so on. And the outcome of this is that once you have expressed interest and are confident enough in taking the next step, you will then be deployed to more complex forest bird communities in places like Kent Ridge Park or Dairy Farm Nature Park to level up your bird watching skills, as it were.
Okay, so yes, we do provide training opportunities for volunteers who want to learn about some of the forest birds. And after that, they can put what they learn to practice by surveying nature parks, forested areas with higher bird diversity. Next question. How do you account for observers double counting or counting the same bird more than once?
So double counting is a very personal thing. On our part, as you learn during the methodology, we try to minimize this by first making the points at least 200 meters apart so that you are less likely to see the same bird across various points, but within the same point, it then becomes very personal. So it depends on whether you are more conservative or a bit more cavalier when it comes to counting the birds. We generally tell our volunteers to be very conservative. So as an example, if you were standing in a particular point and you see two hornbills fly over you heading one way, and then 5 minutes later, you see them flying in the opposite direction, to put them down as being still the same two birds. However, what you tend to notice is that in the field, depending on who is the lead surveyor for the site, they might be more liberal in terms of how many birds they count. And the good thing about having a big number of sites, in this case 64, is that this double counting sort of evens out to some extent because some of your survey leaders are going to be more conservative than others. Whereas if you had a smaller pool of sites, say maybe 20 or 30, these things might be a lot more obvious. So really you can't completely eliminate double counting, you could only just mitigate it.
Okay, so when we train our volunteers, we do try to teach them methods to minimize incidences of double counting. Finally, what is one takeaway from your conservation journey?
So I think the biggest takeaway from trying to make sense of this data and writing this book was that anyone, regardless of experience level, can actually play a role in contributing to our knowledge of Singapore's birds. So as mentioned previously, even if you are an absolute beginner and you are afraid that you can only see things like hornbills, orioles, and kingfishers, as you have now learned, even some of these very common birds have very mysterious life histories, like in the case of the collared kingfisher that no one previously knew of. So even the data that you collect on this bird is already important. And if this is something you enjoy and want to further your knowledge in as you gain more experience in bird watching and learning about the birds around us, then it just means that the data you collect just becomes more valuable and important to us. Essentially, when it comes to urban birds, I would say every bit of data is just as valuable, whether for the common stuff or the not so common ones.
Thank you, Bing Wen. And as he has shared, everyone can play a part in helping us monitor our bird populations. And you can do it too by joining our next Garden Bird Watch. We are now welcoming volunteers for the November round, so do register at this link that's on my screen, which will also be sent in the chat. You can also visit nparks.gov.sg/birdwatch for more details about this program. And now it's time for our giveaway. As Bing Wen has already shared earlier, we are giving away one hard copy of our review of Garden Birdwatch book. As you've seen from the talk, this book is packed with information and vibrant photographs of our local birds. And for one lucky audience member in Zoom, a physical copy of this book could be yours to keep. It's not only a fantastic resource, it also includes a handy pull-out ID card, which you can bring along for your next bird watching adventure. So listen carefully to how you can win. I'll be showing you a question on my slide. And if you know the answer, send it to me, Leslie, as a private message as quickly as possible. The first person to message me the correct answer will be the winner. Do note that your answer will have to be complete and correctly spelled. If I announce you as the winner, please send me your email address so we can get in touch to send you the prize. Okay, let's get ready. I will be revealing the question and send me the answer as fast as you can. The question is, what is the common name of the bird on the book's cover? Okay, I see the answers coming in. Really good. Wow, everybody's been listening. Okay, let me just drop the, I've already identified my winner, so let me just quickly drop you a private message. Okay, we have our winner, and our winner is Rishi Lalwani. Please send me a private message with your email address and we'll get in touch about sending you your prize. So the correct answer is collared kingfisher, which is also known as the white-collared kingfisher and mangrove kingfisher. Once again, congratulations to our winner, Rishi Lalwani, and do send me your email address so we can contact you after the session. To everyone else, thanks so much for participating. Apologies to our audience on YouTube that you weren't able to take part this time, but remember, if you'd like a copy of this book, you can download an e-version on go.gov.sg/gbwbook or purchase one at the Gardens shop in the Singapore Botanic Gardens and get 20% off if you buy it before the end of September. Now, this book would not have been possible without the dedication of our volunteers. Here at NParks, we recognize that community engagement is key to transforming Singapore into a city in nature, which is why outreach programs like Garden Birdwatch and Festival of Biodiversity are part of our Nature Conservation Master Plan. For more information, do check out the links being shared in the Zoom chat or watch our first NParks Spotlight talk on YouTube to hear our group director, Lim Liang Jim, share about this plan. On our YouTube channel, you can also catch up on previous sessions of NParks Spotlight and watch live streams of other Festival of Biodiversity activities. This coming Saturday, 19th September, we'll be joined by Dr. Andy Ang, presenting A Love for Langurs. Learn about the beautiful and elusive Raffles-banded langurs and what is being done to help this critically endangered species. Today, you heard about our new Garden Birdwatch book, but next Sunday, 20th September, you can go behind the scenes of our first guidebook on what else? Bees. The authors Zestin So and Assistant Professor John Asher will be presenting Wild Bees as Watchable Wildlife in Singapore. The registration link for both these talks will be sent in the chat. And don't forget that we've got lots more biodiversity activities from the 5th to 26th of September. Visit the Festival of Biodiversity webpage for more details. Finally, if you are inspired to support our local biodiversity, we hope you will consider making a donation to NParks registered charity and IPC Garden City Fund. 100% of your contribution will go into species recovery projects for our birds and butterflies, just to name a few, and other conservation, outreach, and education programs to support our flora and fauna. You can make a donation at go.gov.sg/give to FOB 2020. This link will also be shared in the chat soon. And this brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you, Bing Wen, for sharing with us, and to our audience too for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed the session and would love to hear your feedback, so do scan the QR code on my screen. We hope to see you again next week, but till then, have a great weekend.